In the dead of winter, under an eclipsed moon, a newborn was left to die on a frozen mountainside. Its crime? Being born under a bad omen. This wasn't a dark fairy tale. It was a brutal historical reality. And for one Alpha King, a single cry on the wind, a frequency only he could hear, would ignite a primal war against tradition itself. This pup was an Omega's child, condemned by a pack council upholding an ancient, merciless law. But its cry carried a unique genetic signature, a howl frequency only one wolf in the world was biologically wired to hear. The Alpha King, a ruler who knew nothing of his own son. This is the true story of a primal bond defying brutal tradition and the race against time on a frozen peak where a single breath meant life or death. To understand this cruelty, you must first understand the Ironwood Pack's law. Their code was not written in books, but in blood and tradition, a direct echo of ancient Roman patria potestas where the patriarch held the power of life and death over newborns. In this world, rank was everything. At the top stood the Alpha King, Lysander, a ruler of such immense, silent power that he was more legend than man to the lower packs. At the bottom were the Omegas, the laborers, the invisible. And between them, a rigid council of elders who enforced the old ways with fanatical devotion. Their most sacred law was the Omen Edict. Any pup born under portent, a solstice storm, a crimson moon, and especially a total eclipse was deemed cursed, a blight on the pack's fortune. History shows this was not fantasy. From ancient Rome to medieval Europe, infants born under evil signs were often abandoned, left to the elements. The Ironwood Pack didn't just remember this practice, they perfected it. The mother was an Omega named Ilara, quiet, gentle, tasked with mending garments and tending the communal hearth. 9 months prior, during the Great Autumn Gathering, her path had crossed with a masked, dominant wolf from a visiting northern pack. A single night, a connection mistaken for a dream. She awoke alone, with only the scent of frost and pine clinging to her skin. She hid her pregnancy beneath loose woolens, her growing fear a constant companion. The eclipse arrived on the longest night of the year. Ilara's labor began as the moon began to swallow the sun, plunging the territory into an eerie twilight. She gave birth in a secluded storage cellar, aided only by one trusted beta friend. The pup was a boy, small but whole, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold the silver of the eclipsed moon. But before Ilara could even count his fingers, the council's enforcers were at the door. They had been watching. They always watched. The Pack Council convened immediately in the Great Lodge. 7 elders, their faces carved with age and severity. They cited precedent, law, and the collective good. The omen spares no one, intoned Elder Magnus, his voice final. A shadow-born pup draws misfortune like a beacon. He must be taken to the place of letting on Mount Cinder, as tradition demands. This was not a discussion. It was a sentencing. Ilara's pleas were met with stony silence. Her beta friend who had aided the birth was forcibly restrained. In a chilling parallel to historical records, Ilara, in her desperation, fastened a simple woven cord around her son's ankle, a token, a faint hope for future recognition. Meanwhile, in his mountain citadel 200 miles north, Alpha King Lysander jerked awake from a deep sleep. A phantom pain lanced through his chest, a tugging deep in his marrow he could not explain. He stood on his balcony, overlooking his vast, sleeping territory, the eclipse painting the world in monochrome. A profound, unsettling restlessness seized him. His wolf, a presence usually calm and vast, was agitated, pushing him toward the south. He dismissed it as the strange energy of the celestial event. He knew nothing of Ilara. He had no memory of the autumn gathering, his mind blurred from ceremonial mead. The child was a secret, a biological truth buried beneath layers of rank and ritual. As the last sliver of sunlight vanished, the council's enforcers took the swaddled pup. Ilara's final image of her son was a tiny bundle disappearing into the shadowy forest, carried toward the treacherous slopes of Mount Cinder. The journey took 6 hours in the brutal cold. The place of letting was a barren, wind-scoured rock ledge at 10,000 feet, a site used for generations for this grim purpose. The head enforcer, a wolf named Kale, placed the bundled infant on the frozen stone. The token cord on its ankle fluttered in the vicious wind. "The cold is merciful. It will be quick," Kale stated, though his words were carried away by the gale. They turned and left, their footprints filling with snow behind them. Here, where biology defies tradition, newborn mammals, especially humans, possess a unique olfactory signature. A mother can recognize her baby by scent within hours. Recent studies suggest fathers can develop this recognition too, a bond forged by proximity. But Lysander's connection was far more primal, woven into his very DNA as an alpha. His genetic line carried a rare, recessive trait, an auditory perception tuned to the specific distress frequency of his own offspring. It was a survival mechanism lost to most modern wolves, but in him, it slept, dormant and waiting. Back at the citadel, Lysander's unease became a pounding drum. He could not sit still. He ordered his elite guard, the Shadow Fangs, to prepare for an immediate, unscheduled patrol of the southern ranges. He claimed it was a security sweep, but in his heart, it was a compulsion he could not name. He felt a pull, a howl forming in the silence of his soul. On the ledge, the temperature plunged to 30 below zero. The pup, against all odds, did not succumb quickly. His newborn survival instinct triggered a cry, not a normal infant's wail, but a vibrational howl, silent to human ears, a subsonic pulse that traveled through the mountain's very bones. It was a signal containing his unique genetic marker. At that exact moment, King Lysander was mounted on his great black steed, crossing the stone bridge from his citadel. The signal hit him like a physical blow. He reeled in his saddle, his hands flying to his temples. A sound, clear, piercing, and desperately alive, echoed in the vault of his mind. It was a howl of pure survival, and it carried a signature that resonated in his blood, triggering a paternal recognition so fierce and absolute it stripped away every other thought. His amber eyes snapped open, blazing with the fire of 1,000 suns. He knew, with terrifying certainty, he knew what that cry was, and he knew who had taken his child. He threw back his head and unleashed a roar of such raw fury that it shook snow from the peaks. The Shadow Fangs froze, eyes wide. Lysander looked south, toward the distant, jagged outline of Mount Cinder, his expression transforming from confusion into apocalyptic rage. Every second was a lifetime lost. The race was on, but the council's crime was already complete. The king's heir was alone on the ice, and the very wolves who served him were the ones who had put him there. King Lysander did not give the order to ride. He was simply gone, a dark streak on a pale horse, thundering down the mountain path with a velocity that blurred the trees. His Shadow Fangs scrambled to follow, their orders irrelevant. They were chasing a hurricane of paternal rage. The psychic howl was a constant, agonizing beacon in Lysander's mind, a thread of sound pulling him south. Every faltering pulse of that cry sent a jolt of terror through him. He was an alpha king, a strategist who conquered through patience and force, but in this moment, he was reduced to a single, primal directive: reach the sound. The journey that took the enforcers 6 hours, Lysander aimed to complete in 2. He pushed his horse to its limits, cutting through treacherous passes deemed impassable in winter. Behind him, his second-in-command, Thuron, fought to keep up, his mind reeling. Thuron had served Lysander for 15 years. He had seen him face down rogue armies and political coups with icy calm. He had never seen this, a face stripped raw of all control, eyes burning with a panic that was entirely, terrifyingly human. Meanwhile, on the ledge, the elements were claiming their due. The pup's initial cry had cost him precious warmth. His silent, subsonic howls were now weaker further apart. The woven cord on his ankle was crusted with frost. Historical data is stark. A newborn exposed to such temperatures can succumb in under an hour. This pup was reaching that limit. His tiny body was shutting down, conserving energy for the vital organs. The thread connecting him to his father was fraying. But the Pack Council, back in the warmth of the Great Lodge, was not celebrating. A low dread had begun to seep into their certainty. Elder Magnus paced before the fire. The king was not due for a southern audit for another moon, he muttered. Why would he move now? Another elder, a female named Hilda with sharp eyes, looked up from scrying the flames. You felt the disturbance in the pack bond. An hour ago, a shockwave from the north. They had all felt it, a ripple of pure, undiluted fury through the collective psychic tapestry that connected all pack members. They assumed it was the eclipse. Now they weren't so sure. Lysander's mad dash was creating its own ripple effects. Border patrols saw the king flash by and sent frantic messages ahead. The Ironwood Pack's beater, a man named Rurk loyal to the council, received the first alert. The king is coming, unannounced, riding like the Hells are at his heels. Rurk's blood ran cold. He had signed the exposure order. He looked at Elder Magnus, his confidence cracking. What if he knows? Back on Mount Cinder, Lysander abandoned his horse where the slope became vertical. He shifted in mid-stride, his human form dissolving into the massive obsidian-furred wolf that was his true shape. His shadow fangs followed suit, a pack of lethal shadows flowing up the rock face. The psychic cry was louder here, a desperate whisper against the howling wind. It led him unerringly to the place of letting. What he saw on that ledge would be seared into his soul forever. The bundled infant was a tiny, snow-dusted mound on the dark rock. It was utterly still, no visible breath. For a heart-stopping second, Lysander believed he was too late. A howl of anguish tore from his wolf's throat, a sound of such profound loss it made the very mountains seem to weep. He stumbled forward, nosing at the bundle with a trembling muzzle. Then he felt it, the faintest thrum, a single, weak pulse of that unique frequency. The pup was alive, but barely, clinging to life by a thread thinner than a spider's silk. Infinite care, Lysander used his teeth to gently gather the frozen bundle. He cradled it against the thick, warm fur of his chest. As he did, the woven cord around the pup's ankle snagged on a tooth. He saw it, a simple braid of gray and blue wool, a token. In that instant, the memory he had lost, the haze of the autumn gathering, the scent of an omega, a moment of connection, slammed back into him with the force of a physical blow. He knew the mother. The scent on the cord was hers. Ilara, this was not just his child. This was her child, and his council had stolen it. The pivot here was catastrophic. This was no longer just about a cursed pup. This was a direct, personal betrayal of their king and a horrific crime against one of their own pack members. The political calculus exploded. Thuron, now in human form beside him, saw the recognition dawn in the king's eyes. "My king, do you know the mother?" Lysander shifted back to human form, clutching the icy bundle to his skin, trying to transfer his own formidable body heat. His voice was a guttural scrape. "Her name is Ilara, an Omega. They took my son from her." The shadow fangs exchanged looks of sheer horror. This was treason of the highest order. But the race wasn't over. The pup was hypothermic, his core temperature dangerously low. They had to get him warm now. Lysander ripped open his own tunic, placing the infant directly against his skin, wrapping his fur cloak around them both. "Thuron, the forward lodge at the base of this mountain. Get it ready. Heat medicines now." As Thuron barked orders into a comms device, Lysander looked down at the tiny, blue-tinged face. The pup's lips were purple. His own rage began to crystallize into something far more dangerous. A cold, surgical focus on saving this life first and burning the guilty to ash second. The council, however, was already moving to cover their tracks. Beta Rurk, under orders from Elder Magnus, was fabricating a story, a tragic accident, a runaway Omega mother distraught who took her sickly infant to the mountains in a fit of madness and perished. They began to pressure Ilara, who was under guard in her quarters, to confess to this fiction. "Say you left the child and you may be shown mercy," Rurk growled at her. Ilara, shattered but not broken, refused. She knew her son's father was dominant. She had felt the bond, however fleeting. She held on to one desperate hope, that the father would come. She did not know that father was the king, and he was already holding their child. Lysander's descent was a controlled avalanche. He moved with preternatural speed, but every jolt was a risk to the fragile life against his chest. He could feel the pup's heartbeat, a frantic bird's flutter slowing. He whispered to him, promises, pleas, words he never thought he'd say. "Hold on, I am here, your father is here." The bond, now that they were physically connected, began to solidify. The psychic cries softened into a sense of seeking, of recognition. The pup, even in its hypothermic state, sensed the monumental presence holding it and instinctively reached for that bond. They reached the forward hunting lodge as a blizzard began to whip down from the peaks. Thuron had it roaring with fire, medical supplies laid out. A pack healer, an elderly Omega named Maya, waited with anxious hands. Lysander laid the bundle on a table before the hearth. Maya worked with swift efficiency, checking for frostbite, listening to the shallow breath. "He is far gone, my king, but his will is strong, he fights." They used warm cloths, not hot, to gradually raise the temperature. Lysander never left the pup's side, one large hand constantly resting on the tiny chest, as if he could physically will his own strength into his son. It was during this vigil that Thuron brought him the first report. "The Ironwood Council sends messengers, my king. They express concern. They say an Omega woman lost her mind and abandoned her sickly child on the mountain. They are searching for her now. Lysander didn't look up from his son's face. They lie, he said, his voice quiet and deadly. They know exactly where the child is, and they know who I am to him. He then gave his first command as a father and a king. Send the Shadow Fangs to the Ironwood compound. Secure the Omega named Ilara. Bring her to me, untouched and unafraid. Arrest anyone who tries to stop you. If the council resists, detain them. I am done with their laws. This was the declaration of war. The king's guard was moving to arrest his own council. The stable, hierarchical world of the territory was tearing itself apart at the seams. As his forces mobilized, Lysander finally examined the token cord more closely. Woven into the pattern was a subtle sigil, an omega symbol entwined with a stalk of mountain laurel. It was a maker's mark. Ilara hadn't just woven a random cord, she had woven her identity, her hope, into it. This tiny artifact was no longer just a token, it was evidence. It was a mother's scream made tangible. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within the lodge. The pup's condition stabilized, but he was not out of danger. Infection, organ damage from the cold, the threats were myriad. And across the territory, the shocking news began to spread in whispers. The king had a son. The heir had been left to die by the council. The Alpha was marching on his own people. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine the pack forever. But as Lysander watched his son take a stronger breath, a new, more intimate terror gripped him. He had won the first race against the cold, but now he had to present a mother with a child he had failed to protect from his own regime, and he had to face the architects of this cruelty who were already weaving a new web of lies to trap him. The rescue was over. The reckoning was about to begin. While the king fought for one life in the lodge, his shadow fangs became a tempest descending on the Ironwood compound. Their mission was clear: extract the mother and secure the traitors. But the council had spent centuries fortifying their power, and they were not about to surrender to a single Omega's truth. They had already moved Ilara from her quarters to a secure, windowless cell in the granary, claiming it was for her own protection. Beta Rurk stood guard, his loyalty to the elders now a noose around his own neck. The arrival of the king's elite guard at the main gate was met with barred doors and a show of force. Ironwood enforcers, armed and tense, lined the walls. Thuron, leading the Shadow Fangs, did not bother with threats. He simply held up the king's sigil, a blackened iron ring, and spoke 5 words that shattered the illusion of autonomy. By the king's own breath, stand down. The authority in his voice was absolute, the pack bond compelling obedience. The gate enforcers faltered, their weapons lowering. They were pack wolves caught between 2 absolute powers, and the king was older, deeper, and currently white-hot with rage. Elder Magnus, however, was prepared for this. From the council lodge, he activated a contingency known only to the inner circle, the silencing. It was an ancient, brutal ritual that used a network of wolfsbane-laced ward stones to temporarily sever the psychic pack bond in a localized area. As the stones hummed to life, Thuron and his fangs felt it like a door slamming shut in their minds. The comforting background noise of the pack, the subtle guidance of their king, went silent. They were suddenly isolated. It was a stunning act of defiance, equivalent to declaring open rebellion. But here, where the council miscalculated, the Shadow Fangs were not just pack warriors, they were Lysander's personal guard, trained for scenarios where the bond might fail. Their loyalty was not just psychic, it was personal, forged in 100 battles. Thuron merely smiled, a cold, dangerous expression. So it's to be this kind of fight. He signaled, and the Fangs moved not as a pack, but as a military unit, using hand signals and tactical formations. They breached the compound with silent, ruthless efficiency. Ilara in her cell heard the distant shouts, the clash of steel. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Was this her rescue or her execution? The door splintered inward, and instead of Rurk, a massive stranger in black armor filled the doorway. He took in her frightened form, the Omega markings on her wrists, and his expression softened minutely. Ilara, your son lives. The king sent us. Come with me if you want to see him. The words were so unbelievable, so immense, that she could only stare. The king, her son lived. She stumbled forward, her legs weak with hope. As Thuron extracted Ilara, other Fangs swept through the compound, detaining the council elders in their lodge. Elder Magnus was found burning documents in the hearth. He was seized, his proud face contorted in outrage. You have no right. The Omen Edict is our law. We were protecting the pack. but the evidence was already escaping the fire. Among the half-charred pages was not just the exposure order, but an older, more damning document, a ledger of Omer payments spanning decades. It listed every pup deemed an omen bearer, their fates, and next to each, a notation of a quota met and a corresponding financial transaction from a neighboring rival pack called the Frostfang Syndicate. This was the "it gets worse" moment. The Omen Edict wasn't just a brutal tradition, it was a profitable business. The Frostfang Syndicate, a pack of mercenary wolves who trafficked in rare magical artifacts, had a superstition that the first breath of an omen-cursed pup, captured at the moment of death, could be distilled into a potent alchemical ingredient. They were paying the Ironwood Council for access to the place of letting. The council wasn't just killing cursed infants, they were selling their last moments to the highest bidder. The ledger showed at least 17 such transactions over the past 30 years. The horror deepened from fanatical tradition to premeditated, profit-driven murder. When Thuron relayed this discovery via satellite comms to the hunting lodge, Lysander's rage reached a new, terrifying temperature. He was sitting by the hearth, his son, now named by him as Kale, after the mountain that almost killed him, sleeping in a makeshift crib swaddled in royal furs. Ilara was minutes away. The news of the ledger turned his paternal fury into something colder, more vast, a purging wrath. He looked at his sleeping son, then at the healer Maya. Keep him alive. I have a kingdom to burn. Ilara's arrival at the lodge was a scene of raw human emotion. She burst through the door, her eyes wild, searching. When she saw the crib, she let out a choked sound, rushing to it. Seeing her son, Pinker, now breathing steadily, she collapsed to her knees, sobbing with a force that shook her entire body. She touched his cheek, his hand, as if to prove he was real. Then she looked up and saw the Alpha King for the first time. He was taller, more imposing than she remembered from that hazy night, and his eyes held the weight of the world. She instinctively bowed her head, Omega submission warring with maternal fierceness. Lysander did something no king had ever done. He went to one knee before an Omega, putting himself at her eye level. Ilara, I did not know I would have torn the sky down to prevent this. His voice was rough with emotion. He held out the woven cord token. You gave him a chance. You gave me a chance to find him. Ilara took the cord, her tears falling on it. They said he was cursed. They said he would bring ruin. Lysander's jaw tightened. The only curse is the greed hiding behind their traditions, and I will end it tonight. But the council, even in custody, had one more move. From his holding cell, Elder Magnus demanded the ancient rite of Alpha's judgment, a public trial by combat and creed, to be held at the Stone Circle, the pack's most sacred ground. It was a rite that predated Lysander's own rule, embedded in the founding charter. If Lysander refused, he would undermine his own legitimacy as a king who upheld the old laws. If he accepted, he would be playing on the council's chosen battlefield, according to their ancient rules. It was a masterstroke, turning a criminal proceeding into a spiritual and political test of the king's very right to rule. Lysander accepted immediately. He would not shy from any forum to expose their crimes, but the rules of the Alpha's judgment were brutal. The accused, the entire council, could appoint a champion to fight for their cause in physical combat. The king, as accuser, would have to fight his own champion or himself, but the real danger was the second phase, the creed of ancestors. Both sides would present their case, and then the entire pack, through a guided meditation, would be asked to consult the spirit of the pack, a vague, manipulable concept. The council had spent a lifetime controlling the narrative. They believed they could sway the pack's collective heart, even against their king. News of the impending judgment spread like wildfire. The territory was thrown into turmoil. Many wolves were horrified by the ledger's implications. Others, especially older generations, feared the king was using this to overthrow all tradition. The pack fractured into factions. Lysander's allies mobilized, but so did the council's secret supporters. The Frostfang Syndicate, hearing their lucrative arrangement was exposed, began to move warriors toward the border, sensing an opportunity in the chaos. On the eve of the judgment, Lysander stood with Thuron, looking at the stone circle from a ridge. It was a ring of monolithic stones under the cold moon. They think their champion will defeat mine, Lysander murmured. Thuron cracked his knuckles. I will enjoy disabusing them of that notion. But Lysander shook his head. No, Thuron, I will be my own champion. It was an enormous risk. If the king fell in combat, his cause fell with him. But Lysander knew the statement it would make. He would not delegate the defense of his son or the destruction of this evil. He would do it with his own hands. The night before the trial, Ilara came to him. She had been silent, focused solely on Kale, who was growing stronger by the hour. She looked at the king, her eyes clear. Tomorrow, when you speak of the crime, you will speak of the ledger of the money, but you must also make them feel the cold, she said, her voice steady. Make them feel the rock under newborn's back. Make them hear the wind that was supposed to be his only lullaby. They understand numbers. They must be made to understand the silence. Her words, the quiet passion of a mother who had endured the unendurable, became the core of his strategy. As dawn approached, the entire pack gathered at the stone circle, thousands of wolves in human and shifted form, their breath fogging the freezing air. The council elders chained stood on one side. Lysander, with Ilara and the now-awake infant Kale wrapped warmly against her chest, stood on the other. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either legitimize the king's wrath and reform the pack forever, or break his authority and send the territory into civil war. The cold wasn't just in the air, it was in the waiting, in the space between heartbeats before the first blow would be struck. The Alpha's judgment had begun, and its verdict would be written in blood and truth. The trial by combat was not a duel, it was an execution in slow motion. The council's champion was Beta Rurk, armed with a silver-tipped spear, his eyes desperate. King Lysander stepped into the circle armed with nothing but his claws and a silence more terrifying than any roar. He did not shift. He fought in his human form, a statement of such profound confidence it stole the breath from the crowd. Rurk attacked with the fury of a cornered animal, his spear a blur of deadly silver. Lysander moved with the liquid grace of a predator who has already won. He didn't block the spear, he flowed around it, his movements economical, brutal. Within 3 passes, he had disarmed Rurk, snapping the spear shaft like kindling. Within 5, he had the beater on his knees, a hand around his throat. The fight was over, but the killing blow never fell. Lysander leaned close, his voice for Rurk alone but carrying in the frozen air. You followed orders, you are a tool, your fate is not mine to decide today. He released him, letting Rurk crumple to the ground, sobbing in shame and relief. The king turned his back on the defeated champion facing the council. The message was clear, his quarrel was not with the soldiers but with the generals. The physical test was over. The king had prevailed. Now came the true battle, the creed of ancestors. Elder Magnus was allowed to speak first. He invoked centuries of tradition, the wisdom of forebears, the necessity of hard choices for pack survival. He spoke of eclipses as documented portents, of famines and plagues that followed past omen births. He was eloquent, persuasive, weaving fear and duty into a solid wall of justification. He made no mention of the ledger. He made no mention of Frostfang. When he finished, a murmur of uneasy agreement rippled through the older segments of the crowd. Tradition was a powerful anchor. Then Lysander stepped forward. He did not address the elders. He turned to face the thousands of his pack members. He began not with words, but by holding up the woven cord token. This was placed on my son's ankle by his mother, he said, his voice calm, deep, and reaching every ear. It is not a royal sigil. It is wool, dyed with berry and root. It is the only shield she could give him against the rock and the wind. He paused, letting the simplicity of the object sink in. Then he took Ilara's advice. He made them feel the cold. He lay on stone for 1 hour and 47 minutes, Lysander continued, his tone shifting, becoming vivid, immersive. The temperature was 32 degrees below freezing. At that temperature, a newborn's skin begins to freeze in minutes. His breath, what little there was, would have crystallized in the air. The wind would have sounded like a beast. That was his welcome to this world, not a howl of celebration, silence. The pack was utterly still, caught in the grim picture he painted. Then he unleashed the ledger. He did not just describe it. He had Thuron project images of its pages onto a pale stone, giant and undeniable. The list of names, the dates, the column for Frostfang quota, the sums of silver exchanged. This is not tradition, Lysander roared, the king's voice finally breaking through. This is ledger work. This is commerce. They did not sacrifice for the pack's fortune. They sold our children's last breaths to alchemists and called it piety. The reaction was instantaneous. A wave of revulsion, a collective gasp of horror that became a growl of building fury. The elders shrank back from the unveiled truth. But Lysander wasn't finished. He signaled, and Thuron dragged forward a prisoner captured at the border, a Frostfang scout. Under the king's gaze, the scout confessed everything: the syndicate's superstition, the distilled omen essence they used to poison rival alphas, the ongoing negotiations for the eclipse-born pup that had promised to be their most potent ingredient yet. The connection was complete. The moral crime was now also a treasonous conspiracy with a hostile pack. The creed of ancestors required the pack to seek the spirit of the pack for judgment, but no meditation was needed. The spirit of the pack was the roar that now erupted from thousands of throats. It was a sound of betrayal, of anger, of a people waking from a long, poisoned sleep. The collective will was a physical force, a verdict of guilty that washed over the council elders. Even their staunchest traditionalist supporters fell silent, their faith shattered by the evidence of profit. King Lysander pronounced the sentence. The council was stripped of rank, titles, and pack marks. Their assets were forfeit, used to establish a new foundation for Omega rights and pup welfare. Elder Magnus and the two elders who had signed the Frostfang agreements were condemned to exile in the northern barren lands, the very environment they had sentenced innocents to. The others were imprisoned for life. The Omen Edict was abolished, struck from the law forever. In its place, Lysander declared the first breath accord, that every pup, regardless of birth circumstance, was a sacred trust of the entire pack. The final surprising detail emerged during the reorganization. The healer Maya, the elderly Omega who had helped save Kale, came forward with a fragile ancient scroll from the hidden archives. It contained a forgotten prophecy, one the council had likely suppressed. It spoke of a shadow-born king who would be born under an eclipse, whose cry would unite rather than divide, and who would end the time of silent stones. The pack saw Kale, the eclipse-born pup now cradled in his mother's arms, and then looked to his father, the king who had heard his cry across mountains. The coincidence was too perfect. It was seen as a divine sign, a cosmic validation of the upheaval. Kale was not a curse, he was the herald of a new era. In the weeks that followed, the changes were profound. Ilara was not just recognized as the king's consort, she was given a seat on the new pack council, her perspective as an Omega and a mother shaping new laws on family and protection. The Frostfang Syndicate, their scheme exposed, retreated from the border after a brief, sharp clash with the Shadow Fangs, who now patrolled with renewed purpose. The place of letting on Mount Cinder was destroyed, the stones toppled and scattered, the ledge consecrated as a memorial. The story that began with a child left to die on a frozen rock ended with that child in a sunlit chamber in the king's citadel, surrounded by warmth and protection. The unique Howl frequency that saved him was now celebrated as a symbol of the unbreakable bond between parent and child, a literal call that could not be ignored. King Lysander's reign, once built on silent strength, was now defined by a roaring, protective love that reformed a kingdom. The pack learned a brutal lesson, that traditions which demand the sacrifice of the innocent are not wisdom, but a rot hiding in plain sight. And sometimes it takes the cry of one child and the father who hears it to tear that rot out by the roots. The story of Kale is more than a fantasy of royal rescue. It is a stark reminder of how easily tradition can become a cage and how authority can weaponize superstition for profit. This narrative, while set in a world of wolves and magic, mirrors the darkest chapters of our own human history, where infants were exposed on hillsides, where omens dictated life and death, and where the powerful wrote laws to serve their greed, not their people. But at its core, this is a story about a frequency, a sound only one being could hear. In our world, we may not have supernatural hearing, but we all possess bonds that call to us in ways others cannot perceive. The pull of family, the instinct to protect, the undeniable truth of connection that defies logic and law. King Lysander's real power wasn't his strength or his title. It was his willingness to listen to that pull, to act on a signal that defied all reason, and to tear down an entire system to honor a single, fragile truth. So the lingering question isn't about wolves or eclipses. It's this: how many bonds go unheard because we've been taught not to listen? How many silent cries exist just beyond the range of our accepted laws and traditions, waiting for someone with the courage to trust a deeper signal? The story challenges us to examine the frozen ledges in our own societies, the places where we sacrifice the vulnerable on the altar of the way things have always been. Howl's cry on the mountain changed a kingdom. It rewrote laws, toppled corrupt institutions, and proved that the smallest voice can summon the greatest strength. His story is a testament to the idea that no one is ever truly alone, and that love, in its most primal form, is a force of revolutionary destruction and creation. This journey of a father's rage, a mother's hope, and a child's will to survive resonated with you. Do us a favor. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that no tradition is worth the cost of a single innocent life. Hit that like button if you believe in bonds that defy distance and darkness. And subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the tales that remind us of our own capacity for courage. Because sometimes, the most important thing we can do is simply learn to listen.